States of America has long been regarded as a symbol of liberty, democracy, and opportunity. Its foundational ideals, freedom, equality, and justice, have attracted individuals from around the world, and its economic and political influence is unmatched globally. However, beneath the surface of these ideals lies a complex reality that often contradicts the image the country projects. Despite its global reputation as the land of the free and the greatest democracy, many of the systemic issues that persist within American society challenge these self-proclaimed virtues. In examining the nation's institutions, policies, and practices, it becomes increasingly clear that the promises made by the United States, whether they pertain to individual freedoms, equal opportunity, or the pursuit of happiness, are frequently unfulfilled for a significant portion of its population. From the criminal justice system, where mass incarceration disproportionately affects marginalized communities, to an economic system that perpetuates wealth inequality and stagnant wages, many of the structures in place seem to undermine the core values the country claims to uphold. Additionally, the pervasive influence of corporate money in politics, selective applications of constitutional rights like freedom of speech, and an electoral system that can result in leaders being chosen without the consent of the majority further complicate the narrative of a government truly, by the people. On the global stage, the U.S.'s actions often contradict its stated commitment to peace, while its historical narrative is frequently revised to overlook uncomfortable truths about its past, including the legacies of slavery, genocide, and imperialism. This analysis seeks to challenge the conventional perception of the United States as the pinnacle of democratic ideals and explore the ways in which its internal contradictions suggest a far more complex and, at times, troubling reality. By examining these 10 key issues, it becomes evident that the U.S., as it is presented to the world, may not exist as the beacon of freedom and justice many believe it to be. 1. Land of the free. The paradox of mass incarceration. The United States prides itself on being the land of the free, yet it holds the largest prison population in the world, both in absolute numbers and per capita. With just over 4% of the global population, the U.S. is responsible for nearly 20% of the world's incarcerated individuals. This glaring contradiction lies at the heart of critiques that call the nation's self-image a lie. How can a country define itself by freedom while locking up millions? The roots of mass incarceration are tangled in political, racial, and economic motivations. The modern era of punitive criminal justice policy began in the late 20th century with the war on drugs, which disproportionately targeted poor and minority communities, especially Black and Latino men. Despite similar rates of drug use across racial groups, people of color have historically been policed, arrested, and sentenced more harshly. Legislation like the 1994 Crime Bill, mandatory minimum sentencing laws, and the three strikes rule led to an explosion in prison populations throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Nonviolent drug offenders were locked up for decades. Meanwhile, privately run prisons and corporate prison contractors began to profit from this massive system, creating financial incentives to keep incarceration rates high. The systemic racism embedded in this system cannot be overstated. A black man in America today is 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white man. Whole communities have been destabilized by mass incarceration, not just due to lost years in prison, but because of the long-term consequences: disenfranchisement, unemployment, trauma, and family separation. Even after release, formerly incarcerated people face immense barriers to reintegration, often losing their right to vote or access public assistance. Worse still, many prisoners in the U.S. are subjected to inhumane conditions, including solitary confinement, forced labor for cents an hour, and lack of adequate medical care. This has led some scholars and activists to refer to the U.S. prison system as a form of modern-day slavery, especially since the 13th Amendment explicitly allows involuntary servitude as punishment for a crime. The myth of the United States as a bastion of freedom becomes untenable in the face of these realities. If freedom is defined by personal autonomy, dignity, and civil rights, then America has denied that freedom to millions within its borders, often not for safety or justice, but for profit, control, and political gain. Mass incarceration doesn't just expose a crack in the foundation, it calls the whole narrative of liberty into question. 2. Equal opportunity. The illusion amid inequality. The U.S. promotes itself as a land where anyone can succeed through hard work, but staggering wealth inequality undermines that promise. The richest 1% control more wealth than the entire middle class combined, while tens of millions struggle with low wages, debt, and unaffordable housing. Access to quality education, healthcare, and safe neighborhoods is often determined by zip code, meaning opportunity is not equal, but inherited. For marginalized communities, systemic barriers like underfunded schools, discriminatory lending, and generational poverty further limit mobility. The myth of equal opportunity persists because it benefits those already at the top. In reality, the American dream remains just that, a dream, for many who are born without privilege. 3. Democracy. When money talks louder than votes. The United States claims to be a representative democracy, but corporate influence has deeply distorted that ideal. Through lobbying, campaign donations, and super PACs, large corporations and wealthy individuals wield enormous power over legislation and public policy, often more than the average voter. Landmark decisions like Citizens United v. FEC in 2010 opened the floodgates for unlimited corporate spending in elections, under the guise of free speech. This means that politicians often rely on wealthy donors to stay in office, and in turn, prioritize policies that benefit big business, whether it's tax breaks for the rich, deregulation, or corporate bailouts. This pay-to-play dynamic undermines trust in the system and leads many to question whether the government truly represents the people or just the highest bidder. In a system where money equals influence, democracy begins to look more like plutocracy, rule by the wealthy. 4. Freedom of speech. Only when it's convenient. While the U.S. enshrines freedom of speech in the First Amendment, the reality is that this right is often selectively protected, depending on who's speaking, what they're saying, and whom it threatens. Whistleblowers like Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning, who exposed government wrongdoing, were prosecuted rather than protected. Protesters, especially from marginalized groups like Black Lives Matter or indigenous pipeline resistance movements, have faced violent crackdowns, surveillance, and arrests. Meanwhile, corporations and public figures can silence critics through lawsuits or non-disclosure agreements, effectively chilling speech. In workplaces, schools, and online platforms, people are routinely penalized or silenced for expressing unpopular opinions, especially when they challenge powerful interests. This creates a double standard. Speech that aligns with the status quo is tolerated or amplified, while dissent is punished or erased. Thus, the promise of free speech rings hollow when it's unevenly applied. If it doesn't protect the powerless as much as the powerful, it's not freedom, it's control in disguise. 5. Justice for all. A system built on unequal ground. The U.S. justice system claims to be blind and impartial, but racial disparities reveal a very different picture. From policing to sentencing, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC, face disproportionately harsher treatment at every level. Black Americans are more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, and subjected to violence by police, even when unarmed or committing minor infractions. Once in court, they often receive longer sentences than white counterparts for the same crimes. The death penalty, too, is applied more frequently when the defendant is black and the victim is white. This isn't just a matter of individual bias. It's structural. Many of today's policing and judicial practices trace back to slave patrols and segregation-era laws. The system wasn't built to protect all equally, it was built to control and contain certain populations. These injustices erode public trust and expose the hypocrisy in the idea of justice for all. Until the system confronts its roots and implements deep reform, that phrase remains more of a slogan than a standard. Stop. If you like this video, please give us a like, leave your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe since we have a new video every week. 6. World's greatest democracy. When voting isn't easy for everyone. The United States proudly calls itself the world's greatest democracy, yet many of its own citizens struggle to exercise the most basic democratic right, voting. Through tactics both subtle and overt, voter suppression continues to undermine electoral fairness, especially in communities of color, low-income areas, and among young voters. From strict voter ID laws to limited early voting and closed polling stations, certain states have implemented policies that disproportionately affect marginalized groups. Gerrymandering, manipulating district lines to favor one party, dilutes votes and warps representation. Meanwhile, purges of voter rolls, misinformation campaigns, and felony disenfranchisement laws leave millions unable to participate in elections. These aren't just bureaucratic inconveniences, they're deliberate barriers. And while politicians publicly champion democracy, many support rules that make it harder for their opponents' supporters to vote. True democracy means accessible, fair, and representative elections. When that promise is denied to large segments of the population, the system begins to look less democratic, and more rigged. 7. Peace and security. Perpetual war in the name of peace. The U.S. positions itself as a global force for peace and stability, yet its foreign policy tells a different story, one of endless military intervention. Since World War II, the United States has been involved in dozens of conflicts, coups, and regime changes across the globe, often under the banner of protecting democracy or fighting terrorism. From Vietnam to Iraq, Afghanistan to Libya, these wars have left behind shattered nations, civilian casualties, and long-term instability. Many were launched on questionable or outright false premises, such as the non-existent weapons of mass destruction used to justify the 2003 invasion of Iraq. These actions often serve strategic or economic interests more than humanitarian ones. At home, the U.S. spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined, while social services like healthcare, education, and housing remain underfunded. The military-industrial complex profits from perpetual conflict, incentivizing a cycle where peace is never truly the goal, only dominance and control. The idea that the U.S. brings peace is contradicted by a history of wars without end. It's not a global peacekeeper, it's often the spark, the fuel, and the fire. 8. A government by the people, electoral college. The electoral college system in the United States has been a subject of debate for many years, particularly regarding its democratic legitimacy. The most significant criticism stems from the possibility that a candidate can become president despite losing the popular vote. This has happened 5 times in American history, most notably in the 2000 and 2016 elections, when George W. Bush and Donald Trump were elected president while their opponents, Al Gore and Hillary Clinton, respectively, won the popular vote. At its core, the Electoral College was designed as a compromise between a direct popular vote and a system that grants more influence to smaller states. Each state is allocated a certain number of electors based on its representation in Congress, which includes both senators and representatives. This gives less populous states a disproportionate influence in the election, as each state's electors are not strictly tied to the population size. In practice, this means that a candidate can win the presidency by securing key swing states, even if they do not win the overall popular vote. Supporters of the Electoral College argue that it preserves the federalist nature of the U.S. system, ensuring that smaller states are not overshadowed by larger, more populous ones. They also suggest that the system forces candidates to campaign across a broad geographic area, rather than focusing solely on urban centers where the majority of the population resides. This is seen as ensuring that the interests of rural areas and less densely populated states are not ignored. However, opponents argue that the system is fundamentally undemocratic because it allows for the possibility of a minority president, someone who is elected without the majority of the American people voting for them. The discrepancy between the popular vote and the Electoral College results can create a sense of disenfranchisement among voters, particularly in states where their votes are effectively lost, because the winner takes all the electors in most states. Critics also point out that the Electoral College amplifies the importance of a few battleground states, where elections are often decided. This leads to candidates focusing their attention and resources on a small number of states, rather than engaging with voters nationwide. As a result, the priorities and concerns of voters in non-competitive states can be marginalized, reducing the overall inclusivity of the electoral process. Over time, there have been calls for reform or abolition of the Electoral College. Some have proposed replacing it with a national popular vote, which would ensure that the candidate who receives the most votes from the American people would be declared the winner. Others have suggested reforming the system to allocate electors in a way that more accurately reflects the popular vote, such as proportional representation or the ranked choice voting system. While the debate continues, the question of whether the Electoral College remains an essential feature of the U.S. political system or whether it should be reformed or abolished entirely is likely to persist. For many, the principle of one person, one vote is central to the idea of democracy, and the current system's potential to override the will of the people remains a contentious issue. 9. Support for the working class, stagnant wages. Despite periods of economic growth, many working-class individuals in the United States continue to struggle with stagnant wages and insecure job conditions. While the overall economy may expand, wages for the majority of workers have remained relatively flat when adjusted for inflation. This stagnation affects the purchasing power of workers, making it difficult for them to afford basic necessities like housing, healthcare, and education. Precarious employment, such as temporary or gig work, has become more common, leaving workers without long-term job security, benefits, or retirement savings. As a result, many working-class individuals are left in a cycle of financial instability, unable to build wealth or plan for the future. The lack of affordable housing is another pressing issue, with rising rent prices and homeownership becoming increasingly out of reach for many. Coupled with the high costs of healthcare, these financial pressures place significant strain on the working class, leading to greater inequality despite overall economic growth. This disconnect between economic prosperity and the struggles of the working class raises questions about the fairness and sustainability of current economic policies. 10. Historical revisionism in the American narrative. The idea that the United States is a beacon of truth is often at odds with how its history is taught, remembered, and portrayed both domestically and abroad. From early education to political rhetoric, American history is frequently sanitized to emphasize exceptionalism, heroism, and moral clarity. This selective storytelling has led many critics to claim that the United States lives in denial about its own past, a kind of national mythology crafted to maintain cohesion and pride while suppressing darker truths. For example, the Founding Fathers are often celebrated as champions of liberty and democracy, yet many of them were enslavers. The contradiction between proclaiming, all men are created equal, and actively participating in slavery is rarely interrogated in standard curricula. When slavery is addressed, it's often framed as a regrettable chapter rather than a foundational economic and social structure that shaped the country's development for centuries. Likewise, the genocide and forced displacement of indigenous peoples are typically referred to with euphemisms like westward expansion or manifest destiny, downplaying the violence, treaties broken, and cultures destroyed. Native history is usually relegated to the past, ignoring the fact that indigenous communities still exist and face systemic oppression today. The narrative of the United States as a liberator in global conflicts also often omits the country's role in supporting authoritarian regimes, toppling democratically elected governments, e.g., in Iran, Chile, Guatemala, and engaging in imperialist ventures. These events are rarely taught with the same weight or detail as America's victories in world wars, reinforcing a skewed image of moral superiority. Textbooks and public monuments play a major role in perpetuating this revisionism. Decisions about what to include or exclude in school materials are often made at the state level, resulting in political battles over how history should be framed. In some cases, slavery is described as involuntary relocation, or the Civil War is presented as primarily about states' rights rather than the preservation of slavery. These distortions affect how generations understand their country and its place in the world. Ultimately, historical revisionism serves to protect national identity and cohesion at the cost of truth and accountability. When uncomfortable realities are buried or minimized, society loses the opportunity to learn from them. The claim that the United States is a beacon of truth becomes hollow when its own narrative is built upon omission, simplification, or outright denial of its past wrongs. Recognizing this doesn't negate the country's achievements, but it does demand a more honest reckoning with how those achievements were made, and at what cost? In conclusion, while the United States presents itself as a beacon of freedom, democracy, and opportunity, a closer examination of its policies and social realities reveals significant contradictions. The promises of liberty, equality, and justice are often undermined by systemic inequalities, from mass incarceration and racial injustice to wealth disparity and corporate influence. Furthermore, the nation's actions on the global stage, along with issues like voter suppression and historical revisionism, challenge the ideal of a government truly, by the people. These contradictions suggest that the vision of the U.S. as a land of equal opportunity and fairness may be more myth than reality for many, raising important questions about the future direction of the country.